Good evening. This meeting is being recorded. My name is Tracy Craig. I'll be moderating the meeting tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the Water Board's community meeting for Bayridge Park for the draft feasibility study cleanup plan. And we're glad that you're here. Just a few housekeeping things first. As you heard, this meeting is being recorded so that we can put it out on Board's website if people want to see it later. You're muted upon entering, and we'll save plenty of time for questions. You can ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll have questions and answers at the end, and then we'll end with actual public comments. I think if you're not familiar with Zoom, to ask a question, you can physically raise your hand. You can also use the raise your hand feature. If you're calling in on an iPhone or another type of phone, you can raise your hand by hitting *9 and then hit *6 to unmute yourself. For property-specific questions about your specific property, please provide your contact information in the chat box, and we will be glad to call you tomorrow to follow up with you. Finally, you can also call the project information line, and John Permani, who's co-moderating with me, has put that number in the chat box. The chat box and other functions are at the bottom of your screen, so you just have to hit them to open that up. Okay, purpose of this meeting again is to discuss the draft feasibility cleanup plan and to answer your questions and also get your comments. We have some handouts that we provided at previous meetings. John has put the link to those in the chat box if you'd like to get those. And now I'd like to introduce you to all of our panelists, and we have a whole bunch of people here tonight. So starting with Jessica Law, who is the project manager for, John, can you change it to the agenda too, if you don't mind? Thank you. So starting with Jessica Law, who I think everybody knows is the project manager for the Water Board. Also, we have Nick Amini, who is Jessica's boss. Nick, can you raise your hand? There you are. And then we have lots of people from Ford. So we have Mike Barnes, who I think everybody knows, Daniela, who everybody also knows, Frank, I might say this wrong, Cezerdi, did I say it right, Frank? Who's a new member.
Close enough.
Okay, that is Frank. And then we also have two toxicologists who you previously met, Karen Kelly and Ursha Vedagiri. So full house tonight. And most importantly, we have you all joining us. So I'd like to turn this over for Jessica. Her presentation is about 20 minutes. Again, the more interactive for us, the better. So if you'd like to ask any questions or things aren't clear, please do stop us, because really we're here to answer your questions and get your comments tonight. Thank you. Jessica?
All right, good evening. Tonight's presentation is going to cover these following items. First, just want to give a brief recap. Then I'll talk about the remediation process. Then we'll go into the remedial action objectives, followed with the feasibility study. Then I will discuss the proposed remedial action plan and the recommended remedial alternative. Next, I'll cover the public comment period and process, followed by what the next steps are. And then we'll end the presentation with the question and answer session. So first, I just want to provide a brief recap of events. The vapor intrusion assessment activities that have been conducted over the last couple of years have collected a sufficient amount of data. This data was used to conduct a human health risk assessment for the Bayridge Park community that we had previously talked about at the last meeting. Conclusions from the risk assessment and our review identified two things. First, that vapor intrusion is occurring at a number of properties based on indoor air results. And second, that based on the soil gas data, there is the potential for future vapor intrusion risk to occur. So as a result, the Water Board requested two reports. First, the feasibility study and remedial action plan, which is also referred to as an FS-RAP, which is why we are here tonight and what we will be discussing. And then second is that longer-term indoor air monitoring plan. Now, Woods submitted the draft FS-RAP on April 9th, and the Water Board provided comments on May 28th. And I want to mention that the Water Board comments, along with any comments you out there submit, will be addressed in the final FS-RAP. So before I start discussing the draft FSRAP, I would like to take a brief moment just to discuss the remediation process. So first is site investigation. Before a site can go into remediation, also referred to as cleanup, it is necessary to know the extent of contamination, and that does include field investigation. Now for this site, that is the soil gas, groundwater, and indoor air sampling that's been occurring over the last couple of years. The data collected is needed for the risk evaluation, which was presented within the risk assessment report. The risk evaluation determines if a site requires cleanup, maybe just additional monitoring, sometimes more assessment, or if no additional activities are necessary at that time. Next is the remedial action plan. And this process develops and evaluates cleanup alternatives, which includes one or more remedial technologies for each alternative for consideration based on selected criteria. And I do plan on discussing those criteria later on. Then the remedial action plan recommends an alternative, and the regulatory agency can accept the recommendation as is, or with comments, or reject it entirely. Now, once it is approved, comes the public comment period step. And the public comment period is where we are now. It's typically 30 days, and this is when the proposed remedy is announced, and it provides an opportunity for public input, and I will talk about that process towards the end of this presentation. Next is remedial design, and this step takes about 6 months, sometimes a little longer, depending on the complexity of the site. And that includes the remedial design and implementation plan that is submitted to the Water Board for approval, as well as securing all of the necessary permits. And then we get into the remedy implementation step. And this includes the safe implementation of the selected remedy, as well as the operation and maintenance of the remedy, which can include regular monitoring. And it is important to note that the duration of these steps may change due to weather, permitting, and other factors. So now I want to start talking about the draft feasibility study and remedial action plan. Again, I'm going to refer to it often as FSRAP. So the draft FSRAP covered the following items that I am going to go into more detail in the coming slides. So first, it proposed specific remedial action objectives. It conducted a feasibility study to evaluate remedial technologies. It then identified and evaluated remedial alternatives based on the feasibility study, and then proposed a remedial alternative for Water Board approval and for public review and comment. So first, I want to discuss the proposed remedial action objectives, also referred to as RAOs, and our comments to those. The remedial action objectives are the goals of the cleanup activities and address each impacted media, the media being groundwater, soil, soil gas, and indoor air. The RAOs can be numerical in value, but are often just descriptive criteria that are protective of human health and the environment. The draft FSRAP did not propose an RAO for groundwater, and it provided justification for not doing so. However, the Water Board did not concur with the justification and noted RAOs must be established in our response letter. It is important to note that while the contaminated groundwater is not significant beneath Bayridge Park, it does appear to be the source of the soil gas plume. Next is soil, and the FSRAP did not propose an RAO for soil, and it provided justification, but again, the Water Board did not concur with not having an RAO and noted that one must be established in our response letter. But here it's important to note that recent soil sampling within Bayridge Park community did not find any contaminated soil above the screening levels, but we do still want an RAO since there will be drilling, and in some areas we will ask for additional soil sampling. Next is soil gas. The draft FSRAP proposed using site-specific screening levels that were developed using the data that's been collected from the Bayridge Park community. There's been a lot of data collected, and the site-specific screening levels are good for some uses, but not as cleanup goals. Therefore, we did not concur with those and did request a more conservative screening level be used for the RAO. Then finally was the indoor air remedial action objective, and the FSRAP recommended using the indoor air ESLs, and we did concur with that. And as I mentioned a couple slides ago, the water board comments, including those to the RAOs, will be addressed in that final FSRAP. So then the next main thing discussed within the draft FSRAP was the feasibility study. The feasibility study evaluates remedial technologies on the following criteria: the ability to implement, the effectiveness, and cost. The feasibility study evaluated approximately 20 different remedial technologies for cleaning up soil, soil gas, groundwater, and indoor air. And at the end of their analysis, 7 remedial technologies were retained because they were determined to be feasible to implement. So following the feasibility study, potential remedial alternatives were developed from the retained remedial technologies. A remedial alternative is just one or more remedial technologies that are proposed to meet the remedial action objective. And the remedial alternatives that were proposed are as follows. Alternative 1 was no action. And I do want to mention that all remedial action plans includes a remedial alternative of no action for comparison purposes. Next was alternative 2, which includes groundwater extraction, soil vapor extraction, enhanced HVAC, and then land use controls, which would prevent the use of groundwater for domestic supply. And then finally was alternative 3, and that included monitored natural attenuation for groundwater, soil vapor extraction, subslab depressurization, air purifiers, and again, those land use controls that would prevent the use of groundwater for domestic supply. So the remedial alternatives are then compared to the National Contingencies Plan 9 evaluation criteria, which are categorized into 3 groups: threshold criteria, the primary balancing criteria, and the modifying criteria. Now, all of the threshold criteria must be satisfied for a remedial alternative to be considered. Therefore, the remedial alternative must be protective of human health and the environment, and it must comply with state and federal requirements. As a result, in this case, alternative 1, which was no action, is thrown out as an option at this point. Next is the primary balancing criteria, and these 5 criteria are used to weigh the major trade-offs among the alternatives, which includes the long-term effectiveness and permanence, reduction of toxicity and mobility and volume through treatment, the short-term effectiveness, implementability, and cost. And then finally is the modifying criteria, which addresses the regulatory and public acceptance of the alternatives. And community input and acceptance is especially important and valuable to the Water Board and is mentioned in the statutes regarding environmental cleanup. So based on the evaluation criteria, alternative 3 was recommended within the draft FSRAP for Water Board approval and to be presented to the Bayridge Park community for public comment. So I'm going to discuss alternative 3 more on the next slide, but first you may notice that the bottom 3 activities are crossed out. That's because based on our review, we noted that both enhanced HVAC and air purifiers are short-term mitigation measures and to the Water Board are not acceptable as a long-term remedy. Air purifiers have already been approved and are in place, or at least they've been offered where necessary. And we noted in our response letter that indoor air impacts from vapor intrusion need to be addressed by the remedial alternative addressing the contamination below the ground. And then the final item that's crossed out is the land use controls that would restrict the use of groundwater beneath Bayridge Park community from being used for domestic supply. That option is not acceptable to the Water Board simply because we consider the groundwater in the area to have beneficial uses regardless of depth, and we don't want to put a long-term restriction on that. Additionally, land use controls are more likely to affect property value in a negative way because they're typically tied to a property deed. So we want to not leave that as an option. The proposed remedy recommended in the draft FS RAP was alternative 3, which includes groundwater cleanup by monitored natural attenuation. And this just allows the natural ongoing processes to decrease groundwater concentrations. It's not an active remediation, but there is monitoring of groundwater concentrations to ensure they are decreasing. And in order to properly monitor the groundwater, additional groundwater monitoring wells will need to be installed. Next is soil vapor extraction. And here is where soil vapors are extracted from below the ground and treated above ground prior to being discharged to the atmosphere, similar to the pilot test, just on a larger scale. And I'll show a figure of that proposed layout on the next slide. And then finally is subslab depressurization. The subslab depressurization just creates a negative pressure beneath the foundation and redirects vapors through piping to above the roofline to address the vapor intrusion. Ideally, we want to start with cleanup with the soil vapor extraction system and have subslab depressurization as a contingency. However, based on scheduling and timing to get the SVE system up and running due to permitting, access, equipment procurement, and other logistics, it may be necessary to start with subslab depressurization, then move to soil vapor extraction. And these are just some of the considerations that are currently being evaluated. So here's the proposed conceptual soil vapor extraction layout. Those green circles are the proposed locations of the vapor extraction wells. They are placed in specific locations based on data collected from the pilot test. The black lines would be the underground piping that would be connected to the wells and run to the soil vapor extraction system. And again, all of that piping does get placed underground for this. At the conclusion of my presentation, I'll show this figure again, and will also discuss this in more detail if you all have more questions on it. And that would be the best time to address those, any questions pertaining to the proposed soil vapor extraction. The proposed areas to be addressed by soil vapor extraction are based on a combination of the current and future risk results from the risk assessment report. And I want to emphasize that this is only a conceptual plan and your feedback is wanted. The final remedial design will be presented in a remedial design and implementation plan, which comes after the submittal of the final FS RAP. And I'll discuss those steps a little bit later. But know that Ford and Wood will be working closely with your community on that remedial design and implementation plan to ensure your concurrence prior to submitting the remedial design for water board approval. Then finally, we have the public comment period, which will allow an opportunity for public input to be proposed, an opportunity for the public input to the proposed remedy prior to Wood finalizing the FS RAP. And I want to point out that that conceptual plan I showed on the previous slide, it did include placing soil vapor extraction systems within parking spaces. And we have heard you mention in previous meetings that parking spaces are already limited and to take any away would not be desirable. So those comments are what we want to hear during this public comment period, and that they will be considered in the remedial design. So the public comment period is from June 7th through July 9th. We will be taking comments following the Q&A session during about the last 15 minutes of this meeting. Also, you can submit your comments to me in writing anytime between June 7th and July 9th, either by email at jessica.law@waterboards.ca.gov, or you may mail them to me at 3737 Main Street, Suite 500 in Riverside, California, 92501. And Tracy, if you would put this contact information into chat as well, for any of those that would like to write it down later if needed. So finally are the next steps. This is based on starting with cleanup, provided the schedule is satisfactory. So first is finalizing the FS wrap and preparing a responsive summary to address any comments received. Next will be water board approval of the FS wrap. That approval will request the preparation and submittal of the remedial design and implementation plan. It's referred to as RDIP here also. And I want to again mention that Ford and Wood will communicate and coordinate the RDIP with the Bayridge Park prior to submitting it to the water board. The remedial design and implementation plan will then be submitted to the water board, which we will review, provide comments if necessary, and approve. And then next would be permitting, equipment procurement, and the construction of the system. And then once construction is complete, startup of the SVE system, and it is then anticipated that the system will operate for approximately 12 months. And during that time, there is going to be some just routine operation and maintenance checks. So for any additional information,
Jessica, the one thing I want to say is that I think you'll be sending a work notice out too when this work happens, and you'll continue to keep people apprised of what's going on, right?
Yep. Yeah, just like any work that Wood has been conducting, they will send out adequate notification to the residents and property owners. So for any additional information, there is the water board's state's database GeoTracker, where all of the analytical data and reports and our comment letters go to. The water board also has an email subscription list called the Lyris list that you can sign up for. We typically send out emails regarding the next public event, such as the one that will be the larger community one at the end of July. The water board also has a web page specific to this project that has some information regarding the vapor intrusion assessment. Ford has also developed their site-specific website, and they have an 800 number as well as an email address that you can reach out to for additional information. And then there is the local information repository at the local library there next to the Civic Center, where we've previously held our public meetings. So that concludes my presentation, and now we can answer any questions that you may have.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify that we're going to be taking just clarifying questions and then opening it up for formal comments at the end. However, if you want to comment now, just let us know that this is a comment and you'd like it included in the decision-making process. Okay, so who's first?
I know it's a lot of information, and if you have just general questions regarding construction, let us know, and Daniela with Wood can also further explain that and has some photos and stuff to help provide some additional detail to that.
Hi, I had a question. I don't know if you mentioned what the schedule would be, how long the vapor extraction will go for, and I'm guessing it might have to do with results, but assuming that you get to a point where you have positive results, then will the monitoring continue, and for how long thereafter to validate that, if you're shutting off the extraction wells, that the levels stay in a good area, since the groundwater is still there, and if that's the source of the contamination, that everything is still good going forward.
Yeah, that's a great question. With any time there's remediation, following that final shutdown, saying it's good, there's no more rebound, there's additional monitoring, longer term monitoring that goes on to make sure those concentrations aren't going to increase because groundwater is still impacted or something like that. So there will be a longer term monitoring there just wouldn't be the active remediation going on. And I don't know if maybe Frank wants to chime in a little more on that.
No, I think you covered it, Jessica. Yes, the plan would certainly be to monitor concentrations in soil vapor for some time and make sure that these aren't rebounding to levels of concern. If they do, the wells will still be in place. It's still possible to turn the system back on and do some further remediation if necessary.
And
Are there any?
I was going to say, and also I think the plan is that the system would kind of operate for a short amount of time because the concentrations at the site are so low that they should be removed or appear to be removed probably pretty quickly. And then the systems would get shut down, allow concentrations to increase, and then turn it back on and do that until there isn't substantial removal that makes it worth continuing the operation.
Are there going to be any sound impacts from the machinery running?
Frank, I'll let you answer that one, or Daniela.
Well, Daniela, do you want to go through it? It sounds like Cara has some interesting questions about the construction and the operation. Do you want to go through your little presentation and maybe that'll answer her questions?
Yeah, sure. Jessica, if you stop sharing your screen, I can.
Yes.
I just would like to clarify, it's Alana that's asking the questions, and Cara, we do see that your hand is raised, so you are next.
Oh, I'm
Okay?
sorry.
Yeah, no, not a problem. So I'm here.
All right, Daniela.
All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So, and I'll just hop through these, but I just pulled together a couple of things to help you guys kind of anticipate what this system might look like, what the impacts might be in a sort of more tangible way. So in terms of kind of disruption, there's going to be installation of groundwater monitoring wells for that natural attenuation, the installation of the soil vapor extraction wells, so all those green dots, the installation of that piping, which will all be underground. But obviously that's going to take, some construction. The construction and operation of the SCE systems. I also have some photos of what a subslab depressurization system might look like. And then kind of as we were alluding to, there's also through this whole process going to be ongoing monitoring, just like there has been. We've been monitoring groundwater, we've been monitoring soil vapor and indoor air, and that will all continue. So some of the things you guys may have seen these in the neighborhood. This is what it looks like when we install groundwater monitoring wells. It takes a drill rig. The process doesn't take too long. It's we can do sort of a well a day. So it depends on how many wells, of how long it will take for us to install. But in the end, it'll be this flush mounted, well cap. You can drive over it, you can jump on it. It'll be closed like that unless we're out there to collect a sample. The soil vapor extraction wells are going to be a little bit larger because there needs to be a little bit more equipment there. This is a photo. This was at an industrial site, so on a residential area, it'll look a little neater, but it gives you a kind of an idea that we set in these well boxes into the ground. This is how they attach to the piping underground. And then we finish them again with this traffic rated a cover that you can drive over. There won't be any bumps. It'll be, just kind of like any sort of manhole on the road that you might already be familiar with. With the piping, to install it, we may have to open up trenches in the street. So they would be open, temporarily. And then they would obviously get filled back in for the duration of the operation. And you would be able, again, to drive over. You won't really notice kind of the where it's been. There may be a little bit of a scar, but in the end of the process, we can also make that look, even more beautiful once we are done. There's also the opportunity, and we think we may do a combination of doing some trenchless installation. This may be for areas such as in those dry creek beds, kind of behind the properties where we might install some wells. We would do this trenchless operation. So it's sort of, you drill horizontally and you can kind of get the piping under there without opening a full trench. To get to your sound question, this, remember, is what the pilot test looked like. We had these vessels, which were the GAC treatment vessels. We had the equipment in this small shipping container, and then we had a generator. And the generator is actually what makes the most noise. And for the pilot test, we used, a diesel generator because it was there. We operated for about a month. When we do the system at full scale, we would plan to tap into the electricity. So you would remove the need for a generator because we'd be able to get power from the power lines. So that would remove a really large element of the noise generating equipment. Within the shipping container, or we may even house it, in something like, looks more like a shed, so it's a little less of an eyesore. They'll have this type of equipment, which includes a blower, and that does, make some noise, but within, we'll provide and implement a lot of sound mitigation measures. I think with the pilot test, we didn't have any folks complain about noise. We did, note that if you're standing really close, you may hear it, but within people's homes, it wasn't super noticeable. So we expect the full scale system to actually be even quieter, and we'll continue putting those sound saving measures in to make sure it's not a nuisance to folks. Any other questions on that?
Hey, Daniela, real quick, I just wanted to add that the shed that we're showing here is just kind of one of the common sheds that's used. We would modify this to match existing buildings in the area, paint colors, trim colors, tile on the roof, things like that, any shrubbery around it that would make it blend in a little bit more.
Okay.
Exactly.
I think Cara has been, is it Cara or Kara, first of all, and she's been waiting patiently. So if you want to unmute yourself, and you can also hit your camera so we can see you if you'd like as well.
Sorry, I was in a different screen and I couldn't find the mute button. Hi,
Happens to all of
it's
us.
actually, it's dinner time. It's Kara, K-A-R-A, Kara. Yeah,
Thank you, Kara.
yeah, thanks. I think I just put my questions in the chat while you were going over that. I just wanted to find out if any homes in Bayridge had issues with the indoor air quality where they had to be remediated. I know that in a couple of the neighboring communities, some people had some, air cleaning systems or something to that effect. I don't know the exact details. I was curious to see if that had happened in Bayridge as well.
So within Bayridge Park, I think the number was about 21. It was either 19, 21 homes. I think Karen may know that number a little better off the top of her head, that have been offered air purifiers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so it's a combination of those results as well as the soil gas results. When they were evaluated within that risk assessment report, that is pushing forward the need for soil vapor extraction for some kind of remedy, along with the potential for a longer term mitigation that isn't inside the home.
Okay, and out of that number of homes, were any of them, so in Bayridge Park, as you probably know, there are some that are ground level, and then there are other condos that sit on top of garages, like a sort of like second floor condominium. Do you know, I mean, is it more likely that the ones that are on the second floor type situations wouldn't be as exposed, or as the ones that are,
that is correct.
Level?
From the results that I've seen, typically for seeing vapor intrusion, it's the first floor units. None of the units that are solely second level, I don't believe I've seen results come in that show vapor intrusion as occurring to those. And we've early on, there was the collection of some soil gas results or indoor air from the garage. And so we had some preliminary that maybe it was occurring in the garage. The home itself was also sampled and there was no exceedances. So,
Okay.
but that's not to say, we still want to be protective of the fact that we're seeing it in the first level.
Yeah.
But typically it dissipates as it's, blending with air.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. And then I just wanted to find out, like, and I should have probably researched this before, but what are the health effects? Like, have any been documented in general to people that have been exposed to like these compounds, like short term as well as long term? I mean, is it more of a long term health issue? If that makes any sense, or
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'll probably have Usha hop on and do a little more clarifying. We normally have our toxicologist from the Office of Environmental Health Hazard on this, but we didn't have her on this call. So if Usha can jump in after this, but there's the primary contaminant of concern is trichloroethane, or TCE, and that has our screening levels are set for long-term exposure. So we're talking at residential, it's 350 days out of the year over a 26-year period, 24 hours a day, 350 days out of the year over 26-year period of exposure. The risk we look at when it comes to like cancer risk is a 1 in a million if you exceed our screening level for indoor air. So the risk is relatively small, but that 1 in a million is what we kind of call the point of departure and what's considered acceptable risk and not acceptable risk. With TCE, there's also a short-term exposure risk when concentrations are a little bit higher than the screening levels. So the screening level for TCE is 0.48, and at 2 and higher, there is concern to the heart of a developing fetus in a pregnant woman. So women within the first trimester, there's been studies that have suggested that there is this risk to heart malformations. And so we have these additional protective screening levels or action levels for that. But we have also earlier on, Amanda reached out to California Public Health. They do cancer kind of surveys and different things. And she reached out for the cancer registry, and I think even like birth defects and stuff like that, to see if there were any anomalies in the area, any statistical anomalies, and none have been noted from the research that she has looked into.
okay, just curious about that.
Did you want to, Usha is a toxicologist with Wood, and would you like to say anything else, Usha, on that topic?
I think actually Jessica covered it very well, probably because Jessica spent so much time on this. I think the only couple things that I would add is that it's practically impossible to see these kind of effects in real life at the kinds of concentrations that we are seeing at the site. And that is because the laboratory studies on which a lot of this toxicity information is first obtained, that is got by exposing rats and mice to concentrations of TCE and other chemicals that are often hundreds of times higher than what you would see in a typical home. And so you use those very high dose studies just to find out if there are even any health effects possible. It's called hazard assessment. And then from that, you try to extrapolate down to, well, I'm seeing this at a very high dose. If it was at a very low dose, would I see anything? And there's a lot of statistics that goes into it. And then you come up with really sort of a theoretical estimate, like Jessica said, of 1 in a million cancer risk that you use to set your protective level in the house. And so there is such a big gap usually between that lab data and what we intentionally set as very, very protective screening levels, that it would be really unlikely that you could see any health effects. But that's all intentional, because you want to be able to have that margin of safety built in, that screening level is really going to be protective. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
We have a question in the chat box. It says, can you discuss the water quality at the present time and or possible health issues? Does that
Yes,
question make sense to you?
it does.
Okay, good.
So the first encountered groundwater beneath Bayridge Park is right about 55 feet. There's been some limited groundwater samples collected here recently, and it was what, Mike, if I recall, in the 20s or 30s, something like that. It was pretty low. MCLs, which are the maximum contaminant levels, allowed the state sets that is allowed to even be exceeded for drinking water is 5 for TCE, and below the ground it's at about 20s, 30s. It's pretty low. You wouldn't want to drink it directly, but it's very cleanupable. As far as health effects from drinking water, there are none right now because your drinking water comes from your local municipality, and they do regular testing and checks on it, and then it is sent to you through your service pipes. And so the groundwater directly beneath the Bayridge Park community, there isn't the immediate contact risk from that. Now, as I mentioned, it does appear that the soil gas plume is coming from that groundwater, impacted groundwater, but it has been decreasing over time. So we would anticipate that the soil gas plume will eventually be decreasing as well. And I didn't know if Mike wanted to jump in with anything extra or if that also satisfied the question.
Yeah, it did. I think we recently installed a groundwater monitoring well on Country Club Drive, which is now the closest monitoring well we have to Bayridge Park. And I think we've had 2 or 3 consecutive quarters of concentrations at between 8 and 10 parts per billion. So yeah, it's relatively low. And then we will be installing, I think, 2 to 3 additional monitoring wells specifically within Bayridge Park to monitor the groundwater, specifically the attenuation of concentrations there.
And I am going to, it's a little after 6:45, so I want to reserve the last 10 minutes or so for formal public comments. If you have them, if you just have clarifying questions, that's fine. I'd just like you to say it's a clarifying question, or I'd actually like this to be included in the comments that the water board looks at and considers before they make a final decision on the draft cleanup document. So if you'd like to comment, please feel free. And again, you can email comments to Jessica or mail them to her via snail mail, and that information is in the chat box.
And Tracy, I think one more question came in to chat.
Oh, okay. So I will read this. Do I understand correctly? You are proposing 5 locations for sheds and equipment, and they will be in place for 12 months. Also, you will repave community once complete.
So Mike, I'm going to let you touch on that one, or Frank.
That's fine. I can grab that one. So yeah, so as Jessica mentioned, that the diagram or the figure that we're showing with the 5 locations, that right now is a conceptual diagram that shows, yes, that would, if it was to be implemented as is, that would consist of 5 sheds connecting to a series of extraction wells with underground piping. As Jessica mentioned, we know that the parking spot issue is a concern to the community, and we'll be working with them to eliminate the need for taking parking spots if we can. I've already had conversations with Enrique We'll be planning site visits down there to do walkarounds, and then the actual final design, which will be presented in the RDIP, will be shared and agreed to as best we can with the community members before it's submitted final to the water board for their approval. And then, yeah, anything that's done to the street, we'll repair it, you know, whether or not it's asphalt, concrete, landscape, it'll be repaired to its pre-existing conditions.
Okay.
What the hell?
I had a question. So I'm reading your page 3, and at the end of a sentence, it says it did not remove a large amount of contamination because there is only a relatively small amount of mass or VOCs in this area, and that's in regards to more information. So can you put that in some kind of perspective? Because when it says there's only relatively a small amount of mass VOCs in this area, I mean, this site plan seems pretty aggressive for just a small mass of VOCs in this area.
Is that you, Jessica, or would that be Mike
I'm
Barnes
gonna let Frank
or Frank? Okay.
take that one, and then Nick can follow up.
It's very perceptive of you, I'd have to say. The total mass that's in the ground is relatively small. It's really off-gassing of VOCs that are coming from the groundwater, as Jessica has explained. But it's also there not only to remove the mass, but to provide a negative pressure underneath the buildings so that any VOCs that wanted to get into the buildings, we would be essentially drawing them away from the buildings. But you are right, it is an aggressive approach.
One thing to add on, Frank, to what you said, just it always helps me to kind of visualize it. So mass, right, is a measure of, you know, weight. So let's say pounds of VOCs. A concentration is a mass per volume. So for a chemical like TCE, because of its toxicity value, we're worried about concentrations. The concentrations can be really low. So there can be a small mass, but a large concentration because it's dispersed throughout the soil, and that concentration can be of a concern, which is why we want to remediate. And so those are sort of two different measurements of a similar thing, but why we're acting aggressively is because we want to treat that or address that concentration that, because of the toxicity level of TCE, is above what's, you know, acceptable for human health in the ground for the future, and we want to get that down.
I understand that, but even after the explanation the doctor gave of, you know, the long-term exposure, I think in the end, and I had this conversation with Mike last night, that we at Bayridge don't mind cooperating, but we don't agree to the skids. I'm just talking in regards to the board, okay? In conversation with other board members, we don't agree to the skids inside Bayridge. I mean, we have property on the perimeter of Bayridge that you're more than welcome to use. However that works, I mean, if you have to put 8 skids on Country Club Road, you know, we're more than happy to do that. And if it takes, you know, longer time, I mean, if you can only put 3 skids on Country Club Road and it takes you 2 years instead of 1 year, that's fine. But we're concerned about the quality of life within Bayridge. Not only that, the appearance of skids for over a year would certainly be detrimental to the pricing of houses here. And it's, again, just not an acceptable way. So we're here to work with you. We certainly want to see this, you've put a lot of work into this, and we want to see this come to a good conclusion. But since we do live here, we have to make sure that it's something that we can live with, especially with such a long timeline.
And I think I'm going to consider that as a formal comment from you that you want considered in the decision making of the water board. Okay.
What was
Can
that?
I respond to that?
The formal comment that you just made that we want.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, and then actually Nick would like to respond to it. Again, Nick is
So the act of feasibility study is the look into different factors for the alternatives that are presented. These remedial alternatives are typically a balancing act between cost, implementability, and in the effectiveness of the remedy proposed. If you can have that effectiveness and the implementability, but a little bit higher cost to make it more acceptable to the community, that's certainly something that we consider. As Jessica mentioned, community acceptance is one of the 9 criteria for doing a feasibility study. And to us, the state of California is one of the most important ones. So please let us know what you think is more acceptable. We consider the cost and we work with you and Ford to come up with something that's acceptable to everyone.
And I appreciate that, but if the cost becomes an issue, then I would say, let's put less equipment or skids or probes out there, keep it within your budget, and let the extraction take 3-4 years. I mean, that's fine on our part. We're doing something positive. We're not looking, I mean, on our part, you came to us with this issue, and we're thankful that you're working with it, but we don't need this resolved in a year either. That's your push, and that's what you're trying to do. But for us, the quality of life certainly takes priority over trying to get this resolved and with this aggressive type of mediation. So again, we do have area outside of this complex. And if you can fit it in your budget to do all the equipment on the outside walls, you know, we're more than willing to work with you.
Yeah, and I don't think these are mutually exclusive. I give you an example. All these locations can be piped into a centralized unit just outside of your system. It's going to be a larger unit and it's going to be more noisy, but measures can be taken to bring the noise level down. That requires opening the streets in your community a lot more to run all those pipings to the perimeter of your community. So it's a balancing act between how easy it is to implement, how costly it is to implement. But definitely, if you want us to stay out, we can do a design in a way to accommodate that. That shouldn't be a main problem.
Okay, well, I appreciate it because the layout you have now, I mean, it wouldn't seem to be that much more to connect the lines. I mean, they're pretty spread out on that wet east sector of Bayridge. And so I'm just speaking off of what I'm seeing here, but it seems like it wouldn't be that much more to connect all these lines together and do maybe one extraction or two, however you engineer it.
and if I can clarify, I think that what I've heard is that this is the conceptual. Do we agree with the soil vapor extraction? And then the guts of it, so how you're actually going to lay it out, where the stuff is going to be, is actually in that remedial design implementation plan. And I think you're in conversations with Mike Barnes. So I believe that once the water board says, yes, we like this approach and the community agrees, the guts of how it will be laid out to balance quality of life can be worked out. Is that correct, Jessica?
Yeah, and also that's exactly right. It's getting the concurrence on soil vapor extraction and the alternative 3 proposed remedies. But then when it does come to the remedial design and implementation plan, I've already spoken with Mike and then Ford to let them know that when they are having those discussions with you guys, with the Bayridge Park community, that we want to hear what those concerns are in the design phase, so that we make sure that what is submitted has addressed your comments and that we don't end up inadvertently approving something that maybe overlooked one of your guys' concerns.
Okay.
And real quick, Tracy, if I wanted to share my screen and share a figure that we have that gives a little more context to what Enrique was referring to. Is
The
that
one thing
on?
I'm just going to say is we're at 7 o'clock, so we're just going to go till 5 after with everybody's
Sure.
comments. And then again, you can submit comments via email. I just want to be respectful of people's time. So if everybody
Yep.
can
Okay.
hang
I'll
out
make it.
5 more minutes, that'd be great.
I'll make it quick. So can everybody see my screen with all the circles?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so we didn't include all the circles, and I'll explain what those are in the community fact sheet because we felt like it kind of busied up things a little bit and made our message a little harder to convey to the public. But what these circles represent is our assumed radius of influence, meaning based on the pilot test, each circle represents what we assume the extraction well pair will pull from. So each green dot has a circle, which is a radius of influence. That's what we need to focus on as far as coverage of removing the potential source for vapor intrusion throughout this particular area. So that's kind of what we need to focus on. The focus isn't so much where these skids are going to be. As Enrique's mentioned, we'd like to try to consolidate those, and we're more than willing to try to do that. And so we'll be conducting site visits in the very near future with the HOA, with our engineers to determine alternatives as to potentially eliminate some of these skids, consolidate and look at the option of putting those outside the wall there. So I just wanted to show this figure to show the network that we're showing. This is what's important, not necessarily, well, the skids are important because they're what's going to draw, but we do have more flexibility with where we place these skids and how big they are and how much they would draw from. So I just wanted to share that quickly.
Great. That was very helpful. Okay, last thoughts, comments. Again, you can comment. The public comment period ends on, John, what's the date? July
9th.
July 9th. You can submit comments via email or snail mail, or you can call Jessica. And I am going to give people just another minute if they have any comments, questions, last thoughts, and then we'll end the meeting. Okay, I'd like to thank Jessica. Did you want to say anything else, or?
We look forward to your comments. That way they can be incorporated so that we can get that FSRAP finalized and move forward with the design plan. But we do appreciate and value your feedback and comments.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody, so much for attending tonight. We know you have other things that you could have been doing, so we appreciate your time and your thoughts, and the water board will respond to them. All right, good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.